Teachers, how easy is it to tell if a student has a crush on another? Story 1. High school teacher here. Depending on the kids' personalities, they either get louder or quieter when their crushes are present. The loud ones are frickin' annoying. The quiet ones are the ones I would purposefully sit next to their crushes, basically. Story 2. This is one of my most treasured memories as a teacher. I was a student teacher, so I was not prepared for this. I asked my students to write and share their own poetry. We focused on sensory imagery, and I had the presentation staged at the local university for a bit more gravitas. Some were funny, some were surprisingly beautiful, but most were banal, and the exercise was mostly boring. This one girl got up in front of the class, visibly shaking. She was near tears for her entire poem. I wanted to help her, but I had no idea what to do. So I just watched like everyone else as she poured her heart out to a boy in the class who did not reciprocate. When she finished, there was a silence in the room, and after a few seconds, which seemed to stretch out forever, one of her friends stood up and ushered her out of the class as the tears began to flow. Nobody made fun of her, but the boy also didn't show that he felt the same. It was just out there with no commentary. It is to this day one of the bravest acts I have ever witnessed. Oof, this story gave me goosebumps. Girl's bravery is truly inspiring, and I hope that she knows that she touched the hearts of everyone who was there that day. As for the teacher, you handled the situation with grace and respect, and I'm sure that your students learned a lot from this experience. Thank you for sharing this treasured memory with us. Story 3. I teach preschool. They tend to lack any sort of filter, so they'll just say it outright, sometimes to me, sometimes to their crush. Matthew is my boyfriend, or let's get married, Julia. They will also occasionally try to kiss their crush. Today, one of my students, Gavin, kissed my hand and proposed. He's 4. It was adorable. I almost wish adult men were as upfront as kids. Story 4. I'm a substitute teacher, and my favorite student with a blatant crush experience was with a second grade class. I picked the kids up from the yard after recess, and a boy came to me very upset because one of the girls had been chasing him the entire recess. Once we got back to class, I talked with the girl, asking for her side of the story. Conversation went something like this. Me: Jose was pretty upset about something that happened this recess. Do you want to tell me what happened? Girl: we were playing. Me: he said you were chasing him. Is that true? Girl: slight blush. Yeah. Me: do you think he wanted you to be chasing him? Girl: no. Me: if you knew he didn't want to be chased, why were you chasing him? Girl: huge blush, guilty smile, and hunched shoulders. He makes me laugh. Oh, I love hearing stories about kids expressing their feelings. They are so clueless and cute at the same time. It's just priceless. Story 5. Computer science, computational physics university lecturer here. Men tend to outnumber women 10 to 1 in my lecture groups. This has resulted in some odd scenarios. My favorite being 4 of my students simultaneously being exceedingly into the same exceedingly pretty woman who is in the realms of shy but unremittingly kind. She also happened to be a lesbian. I knew this. They did not. Of course, only 2 people could sit next to her in a lecture theater, and an actual friend of hers usually took one of those spots. So the 4 of them would try to play it cool as she sat down, then desperately try to get as close as possible without giving the game away. Like a single round of musical chairs where only one person can win, but there's definitely never going to be a prize any of the players want. It's important to also be aware that these were nerds of the highest order, so at a certain point they were just running and shoving one another, charging down the aisle like the adults they apparently were. I was eventually forced to intervene and end the game when one of them, honest to God, vaulted a row of seats and nearly landed on another student. They deliberately avoided her after I pulled them aside, which was probably great for her, but terrible for me. Story 6. Awkward story. My students are all between 8 and 10, and a few have noticeably hit the point where they are obviously starting to notice the opposite gender. I have 2 students that'll give fake names, a boy, James, and a girl, Lucy, in my class. They're always together. Recess, lunchtime, free choice, the 2 are always working together. They are both very shy and giggly, and it seemed a mutual crush was there, noted by me and their math teacher as well. One day, I hear James getting teased by some other kids for his crush on Lucy. His math teacher and I pull him aside and have a talk with him. We tell him that we'll be talking with the class as a whole about crushes and teasing. He's not the only one. His math teacher also tells him that if he does have a crush on Lucy, it's nothing to be embarrassed about because she's a nice, sweet girl. James just looks awkward and asks to go, so we let him. A few days later, I'm walking my kids out to the parent pickup, and I see Lucy's dad is here to pick her up. James waves to both of them as they leave, and I ask if he's been over to Lucy's house to play and if he knows her dad. "Yeah, miss, that's my uncle." In my head, I was like, oh crap, I've encountered cousin love. I awkwardly gather my nerves and start to say, you remember that talk we had about Lucy and liking her? Well, I didn't realize that she was your cousin, so... He then just said, "I thought you did." "That was weird, miss." Then he just laughed and said he liked a different girl anyway from his older sister's class. Well, that certainly took an unexpected turn. It's a good thing that James clarified the situation before things got too awkward. It's always interesting to see how young kids navigate the complex world of crushes and relationships. I'm sure that James will find the right girl eventually, whether it's Lucy or someone else. Story 7. One of my students' father told me his son liked a girl in his kindergarten class. He said, "She's pretty, Dad. She looks like a dragon." The dad laughed and said, "We're going to have to work on your compliments, son." Story 8. I am teaching 7th grade right now. It's crazy easy to tell. It makes me wonder if I was that obvious when I was their age, or worse, if there were girls that were obvious towards me and I didn't notice. It's like they don't even hide it. One of my boys carries a girl's books every day. It is clear to me that he has a crush on her. I learned recently that she has a different one of these guys to carry her books between every class. I mean, that's just manipulative. She's got to know, right? Right? Story 9. I'm not a teacher, but in 6th grade, 2002, a girl in my class, history with Mrs. Thompson, sat in the next row over from me every day. I was crushing on another girl and ignorant to the fact that she liked me. Midwinter, Mrs. Thompson is handing back papers and stops between the two of us while glancing back and forth between the two of us and says something along the lines of, "I don't know who to give this paper back to, her first name, or Mr., my last name." Mrs. Thompson hands the paper back to her. She had been practicing writing her name with my last name so much in her notebook, apparently like many teenage girls do, that she had accidentally written it on homework she handed in. 6 years later, at my high school graduation, a half dozen of my former teachers, including Mrs. Thompson, were sitting around talking with my friends and me and brought up that paper where a girl had written my last name on her paper. They found it cute and endearing and told other various stories of middle school love. A year and a half ago, I married that girl. Wow, talk about a plot twist. Who knew that a harmless middle school crush could turn into a lifelong love story? It's amazing how sometimes the most unexpected things can happen when we least expect it. I guess it just goes to show that you never know where life will take you. Story 10. Depends on the age, but the signs are obvious as hell. Lots of staring and not so obvious, but very obvious attempts at being near them. Visible disappointment when they aren't put in the same group for group work. Jealousy in all forms. I've seen a kid hate a classmate for weeks because that classmate sat next to the kid's crush for morning meeting. Story 11. Former 6th grade teacher here. I was there to witness one of my kids take his first big leap. At lunch, he asked the girl he had a crush on, "Will you go on a date with me?" She smiled and said, "Yes." Immediately, a boy 2 seats away from her said, "Don't go out with that guy. Go out with me." She just smiled and said, "Sure." Middle school is tough, man. Story 12. What's even more obvious is when one has a crush and the other isn't interested. I'm speaking strictly from the demographic from my own school I taught at, so I hope it's clear I'm not generalizing all teenagers here. But I've noticed when a girl is crushing and the guy isn't, he is more likely, but not always, to be more forward about telling her so, to the point, in 1 or 2 cases, of sometimes being openly cruel to her. The girls in the reverse situation act annoyed and will sometimes make their disinterest clear, but more often than not, they grin and bear it and try to pretend the crush doesn't exist. That's all I've got. I was there 4 months. Ah, yes, the classic case of unrequited love. It's like the age-old tale of the tortoise and the hare, except in this case, it's the girl and the guy is running away as fast as he can. It's a shame that some guys feel the need to be mean or cruel when a girl has a crush on them. Story 13. From perspective of a college professor, I can usually tell which of my students have hooked up. I can almost always tell when girls are crushing on guys in my classes. It's usually painfully obvious, especially from the perspective of the front of the room. I can also tell that you're texting, no matter how much you work to camouflage it. Sometimes when I assign group work of any kind, I like to intentionally split up or subvert the secret lovebirds just to see how they react. I'm a bit of a sadist like that. Oh, freshmen, all pheromones, alcohol, performance over confidence, and a complete lack of experience with the real world. Such fun. Story 14. Daycare teacher to kids 6 to 11 here. It's probably one of the easiest things to pick up on. They try to play with the other, but they don't openly admit to it. They spend a lot of time near the other without ever actually talking to them. They sit at the same table, but try to talk to different friends. Basically, they spend as much time with the other as possible without actually becoming friends. If anything about crushes is mentioned, they immediately try to direct the conversation so people talk about them and their crush. And the second the two are mentioned together, the crusher blushes. Not to brag, but I have this 10-year-old that has a pretty obvious crush on me. I mean, I'm a teenage male who spends 20 hours a week with her, so it's entirely understandable. I should mention that I don't encourage it or anything. I treat her like all the others. Granted, she is one of the oldest, so she does have more responsibility, and she is able to have deeper conversations. But she tries to make my life easy. She will help clean, cook, and take care of the younger kids. She does it to impress me, and I sincerely appreciate it. I will say again that it is completely normal. I had crushes on babysitters, so do we all. I feel kind of bad for her now because she puts a lot into it, but I know she'll smile looking back on it as an adult. There is another kid who is 6, maybe 7 now, who has a crush on one of the 9-year-old kids. I mean, they are not entirely on the same level mentally. First grade and third grade are about as far apart as third grade and ninth grade, night and day. So it's kind of sad because he's chasing after her. She knows, I think, about the crush, and it makes her a little uncomfortable, but she's sweet about it. Story 15. I've taught many different age levels, and their crushes are all pretty obvious. My favorites, kindergarten boy throwing himself on floor with glee. I don't know what's going on with these girls, but I love it. Fifth grader matter-of-factly saying, listen, I have a crush on Connor, so if you could move my desk by his, I would appreciate that. And one of my students using lunch on a field trip to ask a girl on a pizza date. She accepted, and he wore extra nice clothes. They sat at their own table, making conversation in their own world. All of the adult women chaperones were very impressed. Story 16. I'm more than positive my teacher, hitched me and my now girlfriend when we were in 7th grade. For some reason, 3 weeks into the school year, he moved a few people around and put this girl in front of me, and we started talking pretty fast. Never got mad if we were done with work and turned around to start talking to each other. Never teased us either. He even rearranged the entire formation of desks a few times and always sat me and her together. We've stayed together through middle and high school, 10 years and counting, and are planning on getting married. Well, I guess you could say that your teacher had a knack for desk arranging. It's clear that he saw the potential for a love connection between you and your now fiancé, and he was determined to make sure you two were always in close proximity. Story 17. I'm not a teacher, but when I was in high school, we had this program where if you were a high-performing student, you could help out in teaching grade 1 and grade 6 in the elementary school nearby. Anyways, I was teaching grade 6 students some grammar on the board, and I caught on earlier in the year that they loved picking out the names in the sentences I used. There was this really quiet girl in that class that I'm pretty sure 90% of the boys in the grade were in love with. Let's call her Allison. Poor Allison was seated with boys who lived to serve her, but she was really oblivious to it. One day, I'm creating a paragraph on the board and asking input from this boy about what he wants it to say. Then I say, okay, let's put a girl in that sentence. Who's your girl? I meant give me a random girl name. Except he states loud and clear without even a second of hesitation, "Allison!" The whole class goes quiet. The teacher snickers at her desk, and I try not to double over laughing. Everyone turns around and looks at Allison, who's blushing bright red and flipping papers loudly for no reason. It was so cute. Poor Allison had so many subtle confessions. One time a boy sitting in front of her brought 18 books for her to read because he knew she loved to read. He would lug them around from home to school, back and forth, just so she can read them during quiet time. She thought he was carrying 2 books at the most and was switching them out every day, but he didn't do things halfway like that. Not to mention another time, an older boy held her hand down in the snow for too long. She came to me holding back tears and asking me to please help with warming her hands. She couldn't feel them. The older boy's younger brother, who was in class, kept hugging her, holding her hand, warming it so gently. Then, when she was okay, he ran out of the class and beat up his big brother. I have a whole lot more stories. She just stuck out to me so much because apparently she had been going through that since her 2nd grade year, LMAO. She was a very smart and capable girl, not really the helpless type, so it bewildered the teachers why the boys put her on such a pedestal. Story 18. I teach English. I remember a star football player, senior, coming into the room to rap with me for a bit before 3rd period started every Friday. In my 3rd period, a female student, junior of mine, who was extremely intelligent and very pretty, yet somewhat shy, being an AP student and all, was sitting in the front row and always stared at him when he came in. He would talk about football and stuff with me, and every so often I'd look back at her, still staring right at him and smiling the entire time. She would not turn that smile off no matter who was looking or what anyone said. It was actually one of the cutest, saddest things I ever saw, seeing as how the guy never even turned around to notice her. If he did, who knows? Maybe they would have hit it off. Maybe they did after they weren't my students. Maybe they did hit it off after they weren't your students. But let's be real, if he didn't notice her staring and smiling at him every Friday, I doubt he noticed it in less obvious situations. Story 19. I work in a college and teach early morning classes to 17 to 24-year-olds, mostly. It is painfully obvious who just did a walk of shame to class, and occasionally who is fricking someone else in the room. The most awkward thing that ever happened was some guy who came into the class and interrupted a lecture to hit on a girl in the front row. He wasn't even a student, just some sucker who walked by our open campus and recognized the girl through the window as the girl who he saw at Jack in the Box a week earlier. More details on the second story. He comes in and just starts talking to her. I am in such shock that this guy just randomly walked in. I was speechless and just stood there watching it. After about a minute, I came to my senses and realized the situation. Here is this 40-plus-year-old dude tatted up with his pants hanging from his butt, reeking of booze and cigarettes at 9 a.m., hitting on a very uncomfortable-looking tiny blonde 18-year-old. I tell him that this is my classroom and that I wouldn't have him interrupting. He would have to go. He didn't put up a fight, just asked when class was over so he could come back to mack him some. I told him we were out at noon. We were really done by 10, and that was the last day of class. The day of the final, a week later in a different room, I kept my eyes open, but he never showed. I asked the student, but she only knew him from a single instance of standing in line in front of him at Jack in the Box. Story 20. In middle school, they just start trying to get on each other's nerves more and are usually overly smiley. The main problem comes when only one of them is smiley. Story 21. Oh my God, yes, we always know. The most blatant one is when a student came to me talking about one of the girls in class kept looking at him and he couldn't focus. It's weird and she looks like a bug. I pulled her aside to ask if she liked him, and she nodded up and down really fast and excited. I had to talk to her about not staring, and she said she understood. She stopped staring, but started sitting in front of him and twerking in her seat, or dropping things and bending over to get them in front of him. They were in 6th grade. We had multiple parent-teacher conferences about it. Story 22. Oh man, the longing stares across the room. The almost creepy, wistful what-ifs you can just see in their eyes. When I was in middle school, that was me. Please leave your story down below in the comments. I would absolutely love to make a video about them in the future. And also, don't forget to like and subscribe. And until next time, peace.